Buffalo River, which sometimes flows in flood as much as 50 to 75 meters wide. Imagine galloping your horse away from a fierce enemy, down through the bush, slithering down on its flanks into the gorge itself, swimming your horse across this river, and having spears thrown at you. Some people said it was like hail coming around them through the river. Anybody who's swum in a river will understand that swimming in a river itself is not the treacherous thing, because it's like being in the surf, but it's the hidden rocks below which can smash a rib, break a leg, hurt an arm, cripple you. That's the main thing. And these soldiers were forced to swim this to get up to the Natal side, away from KwaZulu, and to survive. The Zulu people call this the Mzinyati River, the Buffalo River. Unpredictable, wild, dangerous, and hauntingly beautiful as well. Recognizable mountains in the whole world. Crouching lion of Isandlwana. In the neck, you can see the monuments of the 24th Regiment, the Maritzburg College, the Natal Carbineers. And on the right-hand side, there's the hill of Blackskopje, named after Hamilton Black, the New Zealander who led a bayonet charge up there at the end of that fateful day of the 22nd of January in 1879. Why did nobody get up the top of the mountain and escape that way from the oncoming Zulus? They, of course, attacked with the left and right horn, or rather left horn and the center column, in the middle there where the monuments are today, wiping out that camp. Because the men were instructed to protect the wagons. The wagons, the 300 wagons that were in the neck there, contained the supplies for 2 months' worth of fighting in the war that lay ahead. And in looking after the wagons, basically there they perished. The right horn came around as we're looking at it now, the left-hand side of the Isandlwana mountain, camped, or rather sat on their shields in the lee of the mountain. And this very road that we're on at the moment, obviously there was a mere track there in those days. They jogged up this track, and at about 4:30 in the afternoon, that same afternoon of the 22nd of January 1879, they arrived at Rorke's Drift, and there attacked it. From. How do we know what actually happened? Well, sometimes it's oral evidence. It's the evidence which is being passed down around the campfires in the evenings and so forth. And maybe sometimes it's actually put onto record. Come over here and look at this horn over here. Look carefully at it. And what you can see are some of the sketches which have been reproduced in this most magnificent and accurate book by Professor Laband and Dr. Jeff Matthews called Isandlwana. You look carefully, you can see those same illustrations which have been reproduced in this book. Raging down through the ages is, of course, why didn't the British have enough ammunition to chase the Boers away, the Zulus away? Well, it's quite obvious that there was a problem in actually delivering the ammunition to the men on the front lines. Somebody said, well, maybe it was the quartermasters, the British quartermasters, who left their screwdrivers behind at Brock's Drift. And for many years, people believed this myth. A more simpler explanation is that simply it was too heavy to carry the ammunition all the way from the wagons all the way out. A simple kick, a simple boot to the edge of this ammunition box would open it up. It was fastened by one brass screw. Box like this and smash on an army wagon wheel. That's the one way of getting it out. If you've got 20-odd thousand Zulus coming down towards you, it's amazing how...
The quartermaster sergeants are reputed to have said, no, you can't.
Now, who would pass around a story like that unless it benefited them to think that the British were a little slow on the uptake?
Yeah.
Been in the country for 150 years. Since 1848. And they came up with it as the Berchtesgaden settlers. People like the Zulus, Vlees, Hellemans, the Lagers, Penningrammers. They all came out on the same ship together. Yes, we had it, and they're your husband as well. See, that's it? Yeah. That's right. Monument to the 24th Regiment, the South Wales Borderers. The men who took the brunt of the battle here against the Zulu forces, the main Zulu army, under Chief Chingwayo and the other chief, Mabumengwana. And about 1,400 men in all were perished on this particular day. But it should be remembered that not all of them were these sturdy little Welshmen, but were brave African soldiers who also fought on the British side. Chase back. Zulu accounts of the battle are fairly good as well. Excellent book to be read is published by the KwaZulu Monuments Council called Fighters in the Open, edited mainly by Professor Band. One of those accounts speaks about a man, one of the British soldiers of the 24th Regiment, who they say fought until the shadows were long on the ground. Now we're talking about the 22nd of January, so what time would that be? 6 o'clock? 6:30 in the afternoon? But this man had taken enough firearms, enough ammunition to the cave that you see up there, that square cave, and instead of doing what many of us would have done and tucked himself away and hoped for the best as the looting and the rampaging in the campsite by the Zulus, who had now annihilated the British force, was going on. But instead, this man kept on opening up and shooting down into the camp at the Zulu forces. Eventually it got too much, and some of the leaders instructed their men to climb up between these rocks that you see in them, between the bushes, and to use their own firearms, which they'd got hold of, and shoot up there. And there's a very famous painting of a man who has a beard. In Afrikaans we call it a bokbaard, and he's tumbling out of that cave that you see there. And the title of the painting is The Last of the 24th. This man was possibly the last person of the invading force to survive here at Isandlwana.
This is skeletons at the London Museum.
Now, how fresh is that? I mean, how many years ago is it since the last cannibals were around?
1831.
30s.
That's
during the Vic time.
Well, they started about 1806 to 1834.
It was during the beginning of the Shaka reign. As you look around the battlefield, you'll be able to see so many piles of white stones. You see, after the battle, the 24th Regiment requested the honor of burying their own men. This obviously was a difficulty because, well, they'd been fighting in enemy territory and the Zulus might still be around here. And of course, so many had perished on this battlefield of Isandlwana and other places as well. They had to recruit new boys back in the valleys of Wales. And so the first time that the boys saw any action at all was burying their comrades 5 months later here at Isandlwana. The ground is particularly hard, and so they clear a little cleft and then bring the skeletons around from the vicinity of each hole, put the skeletons in. Many of them hadn't any uniforms on it at all. There were very, very few distinguishing marks. Very few people were positively identified. And they put stones on the top, whitewashed them, and these are the stones that you see around you. What happened to the brave Zulu warriors who are defending their independence, though? What happened to them? Accounts vary from about 1,000 to 2,000 of those soldiers who died, and most of them got carried away back to the ammunisie or back to their homesteads by their friends and given burials back there, or possibly crawled off and into a donga somewhere and perished there. Here's a thought. What about a memorial to the Zulu who died here? We see plenty of memorials to the British. There's even a very famous South African school, Maritzburg College, which has a memorial here. But not a simple statue or a plinth or something like that. What about in the vicinity here, maybe a library for our local school, Goddelike High School? Wouldn't that be a more fitting memorial, living memorial, of those who died so bravely right here at Isandlwana?
This place is probably the most nostalgic part of the Battle of Isandlwana, in the sense that Captain Younghusband, who made his last stand here, was probably the last survivors of the British soldiers that took part in the Battle of Isandlwana. They fought their way up from the present-day entrance gate, up against the side of the hill until they ran out of ammunition, and then they stood with their backs against all these big rocks on the side of the hill, and eventually they reached this position. And this part of the story is only recalled by the Zulus, because there was nobody else who survived this part of the battle. The one story which is very touching here is that it is claimed when Captain Younghusband arrived here, he put his hand in the air, and for a brief moment the war stopped, and the 28 men that were still alive with him here stood in a circle, and they then shook hands, fixed their bayonets and fought to the end. Now when I say this is probably the most nostalgic part of the battle, is that from this position he could see the graves down below, he could see the fugitives' trail, and he probably realized that there was no way out. And looking down at the graves below, by that time the Zulus were now starting to annihilate the bodies and consuming anything that was drinkable in the tents, destructing the tents and everything else down below, disemboweling the people, And looking down the Foods trail, he probably realized that there was no hope of any chance of escaping, and that they had to fight it out, which then did happen. They stood back to back, and they fought, and 28 men with Captain Reginald Younghusband died, and this is a memorial where their bones were eventually interred.
Standing right sort of like on the edge of Mngeni Falls, and it's always fascinating being with somebody that knows history so well, like Kevin. To my wife, she's always been my right hand. Just want to give her a quick kiss. Thank you for always being so patient. We're trying to give something back to people, whoever is going to watch this video, about life, but life in abundance. We sometimes just take life for granted. But if you come to places like this and you see the waterfall and so on, then you realize there must be somebody higher, a creator that still loves us a lot, even with our inability sometimes to do things right. And Kevin, it was most joyful today being out with you, seeing all these places. And I can assure you, whoever is going to use Kevin in future as a tour guide, you will never be disappointed.
It will never be the same.
Isandlwana, one of the greatest disasters in the history of the British Army. The shattering news of a whole British regiment, armed with the most modern weaponry, being wiped out by a native foe, resounded around Victoria's empire. How could it have happened? Our journey back in time, with clues from the present, may give part of the answer. It all began with the British government's resolve to confederate all the territories in southern Africa, including the Zulu kingdom. Sir Bartle Frere, the British High Commissioner, determined to provoke war with the Zulu people. And when Mehloga Zulu, a son of Sikhayo, accompanied by other warriors, crossed into Natal in pursuit of his father's adulterous wife, Sir Bartle magnified the incident and would later use it as an excuse to invade Zululand. Within a few months, at a crossing on the Tugela River, once a remote outpost, but now on the route of a major highway, Sir Bartle delivered an ultimatum to the Zulu kingdom, which demanded, amongst other things, the disbanding of the entire Zulu army within 30 days. Failing which, Lieutenant General Lord Chelmsford, commanding Her Majesty's troops in southern Africa, would invade and enforce submission. The driving force of Chelmsford's army would be its imperial infantry, many of whom had fought and marched much of its way up through the Cape and were now heading for Natal. It is doubtful whether the Zulu monarch, King Cetshwayo, understood the imperial demand, for he and his people had lived in peace with their British neighbors of Natal for over 40 years, and there was as yet no cause for war. Indeed, over the weeks that followed, Cetshwayo would send many messengers, such as his royal messenger Mfunzi, to seek discussions for peace, but most were either sent packing or arrested as spies. It was neither Britain's wish nor intention that Cetshwayo should comply. Sir Bartle Frere's intent was the conquest of Zululand. 30 days later, Lord Chelmsford's troops, in 3 separate columns, invaded the Zulu kingdom, setting in motion events that were destined to end in one of the most disastrous defeats ever to befall a British army. Lord Chelmsford, accompanying the centre column, commanded by Colonel Richard Glynn of the 24th Regiment, virtually usurped Glynn's authority and took over the command of the column himself. With 5,000 men, they descended the Tugela Valley and followed the ridge of the Biggersberg. Finally, they crossed the Buffalo River into Zululand at a place called Rorke's Drift, a name also destined for fame and a place in military history. Like the rest of Chelmsford's army, the main strength of the column was its British infantry, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 24th Regiment of Foot. The men of the former battalion, having fought and marched up Africa much of the way through the Eastern Cape, a distance of almost 2,000 miles, were tough, hardened soldiers. They were armed with the modern Martini Henry breech-loading rifle, with its 22-inch triangular bayonet attached, and in the hands of a trained soldier was one of the most modern and formidable weapons of its time. There was also a battery of the Royal Artillery, a contingent of engineers, several units of colonial cavalry, including the Natal Carbineers, recruited from the Natal settler population, and a squadron of Natal Mounted Police. There were also 2 regiments of the Natal Native Contingent, conscripted blacks of Zulu origin, now living in Natal under the protection of the colonial government. The Natal Native Contingent was poorly armed, only 1 firearm for every 10th man, the rest carrying spear and shield. In appearance, there was little difference between them and their Zulu kin, who were now their enemies. They were also indifferently led, their white NCOs having been largely recruited from amongst the ranks of the colonial unemployed. The Natal Native Contingent amounted to almost 60% of the column's strength. To oppose Chelmsford's invasion, the Zulu Army, a military wonder of its time indeed. Never before in Black Africa had such a force of disciplined, drilled and dedicated warriors opposed a modern European army. However, the Zulus were yet to earn world renown for their skill, ferocity and courage, and perhaps as a consequence were grossly underestimated. Almost despised by virtually every strata of Chelmsford's army. Chelmsford himself creating a standard for overconfidence and arrogance by remarking,
"I shall strive to be in a position to show the Zulu how hopelessly inferior they are to us in fighting power. We may possibly induce the Zulu king to attack us, which will save us a great deal of trouble."
And an officer writing home to his mother proclaimed,
"The number of troops that have gone into Zululand is 13,000, a sufficient number to beat the Zulus 10 times over."
And a corporal of the 24th Regiment, also writing home, commented on the powerful build of the enemy and boasted,
"Although large and powerful, they've not the pluck and martial spirit of an Englishman."
How right he was regarding their stature. The average Zulu warrior being some 3 to 4 inches taller than a British soldier. But how wrong his assessment of their valor. The Zulu army was a citizen force, and in times of national emergency, every man throughout the kingdom would leave his home and join his age group regiment, bringing with him his personal weapons. The youngest of the regiments was the Ingobamakosi and the Uwe, warriors in their early 20s, and the oldest, most probably the Tulwana regiment, men close to 50. In their regalia, they were the epitome of splendor, but regalia was expensive and encumbering. In battle, the Zulu warrior fought all but naked. Having crossed the Buffalo River, Chelmsford and his army, with their band playing stirring martial tunes, entered Zululand unopposed. To the ordinary British soldier, it was a place of remote and harsh landscapes, yet at times there were aspects of great beauty. And first amongst the landmarks that captured the gaze of the advancing army was the strange-shaped hill to the northeast that rose out of the plain and had, over the millenniums, been reduced by time and wind to the outline of a crouching beast. It was called Isandlwana. Most would have been unable to pronounce its name, Isandlwana, Yet it was a name that would forever be synonymous with the death and defeat of the red-coated soldiers. A few miles from the Buffalo River was the home of Chief Sikhayo. However, neither Sikhayo nor his warriors were in residence. They were already on their way to Ulundi to join the mobilizing army of the king. But his stronghold, a fortress-like place of hills and caves, lay close to the line of Chelmsford's advance. The few defenders who remained put up a stiff but futile resistance. They were either killed or taken prisoner, and the advance continued. Chelmsford's first concern was now the movement of his ponderous convoy of over 200 wagons and 3,000 oxen that was required to carry the tons of food and equipment for his army. It had taken 10 days to move the 10 miles to Isandlwana Hill. The oxen alone could not cope with the slippery and rocky terrain, and the troops, working like navvies, pushing and dragging the wagons in the heat of the African summer, soon became exhausted. At last they reached the strange-shaped hill where the soldiers of the 24th were struck by the odd coincidence of its shape, that of a sphinx, being the same as their regimental badge, an honor awarded many years previously for heroic deeds performed in Egypt. Was it an omen for good or evil? The men set about erecting camp, a veritable town of tents over 1,200 yards long, each row being beautifully aligned as the NCOs chivied and bullied the men to obtain perfection. But perfect though the camp might appear, on the site selected by Chelmsford and his staff, it was virtually defenseless, as so clearly illustrated by this painting of Colonel Creelox, Chelmsford's military secretary. Far away, over the great rolling hills and valleys to the northeast, the Zulu army was also stirring. Its Sanusi war doctors preparing the warriors for war, whilst their king inspired the lust to wash their spears in the blood of the red soldiers. It was an army of virtual athletes, amounting to 40,000 warriors, who had been spine-chillingly described by Sir Bartle Frere, the British High Commissioner, as celibate, man-slaying gladiators. Yet they, like the British, drilled and fought in regiments, each having its own uniform and regalia. However, unlike Chelmsford's ponderous army, they were as fleet and mobile as cavalry, and 25,000 of them would, in a mere 5 days, cover 7 times the distance that Chelmsford had marched in 10. It was also an army whose whereabouts, as far as the British were concerned, were completely unknown. Lord Chelmsford would have to find it. Back at Isandlwana, there were those who were unhappy with the defenseless situation of the camp. The scouting vedettes of the Natal Carbineers, mounted police, and other horsemen had been placed at vantage points by their officers 5 miles out from the camp. Positions from where they would be able to give timely warning of an advancing enemy by circling their horses. But Senior Staff Officer Major Cleary would not have it, and ordered the vedettes in closer where they could be seen. Highly concerned at this move, the mounted police officers reported their concern direct to Chelmsford, who replied contemptuously,
"Oh, tell the police officer that it will be my troops who will do the attacking, not the Zulus,"
and dismissed the matter. However, in order to attack the Zulus, they must first be found. So it was the next day, the 21st of January, Chelmsford, accompanied by his staff and a small mounted escort, reconnoitred onto the Ngutu heights above the camp and the Malagata hills to the south. It was a vast and empty land. The whole of the Zulu population had vanished. The only sound was the wind blowing through the tambuki grass. Yet the land was not as void as it appeared, for the Zulu army, covering a relaxed 12 miles or more a day with ease, was getting closer. Indeed, the vanguard would have been in sight of those vedettes had they not been withdrawn by Major Cleary. Now the leading Zulu regiments were less than 12 miles distant and still undetected. Frustrated in the attempts to find his enemy, and having received intelligence that the advance of the Zulu army would come from the southeast, Lord Chelmsford ordered 1,600 men of the Natal native contingent into the Malagata and Hlazagazi hills, whilst colonial horsemen would strike across the plain and eventually link up with the contingent near the Mangeni Falls, 10 miles east of Isandlwana camp. This force, under the command of Major Dartnell, scouring the empty countryside, advanced east, while the Zulu army, marching on a parallel course some 5 miles distant, advanced undetected towards the Ngutu Heights, from where the warriors would be able to see the distant British tents shimmering in the heat haze. Late in the afternoon, Dartnell's horsemen encountered what was probably a flanking force of the Zulu army. The warriors being reported later as very anxious to fight. Eventually, 40 of the horsemen skirmished with the Zulus and revealed their numbers. It was a trap. The warriors in their hundreds rose from the long grass, encircling the horsemen who, at a gallop, just managed to break through the cordon. Unbeknown to Dartnell, the Zulu commander had reinforced the flanking patrol. It had now become an impressive decoy that would lure the redcoats from their camp, while the main Zulu army, still undetected on the Ngutu Heights, less than 5 miles away from where the British tents were, prepared itself to attack. Dartnell, now believing he was facing the vanguard of the Zulu army, sent a dispatch rider for reinforcements. The messenger waking Chelmsford and his staff in the middle of the night. Chelmsford, convinced that Dartnell had found the Zulu army, aroused the camp, and at 4 a.m., as the first streaks of dawn began to light the eastern sky, marched off with over half the column's strength, plus 4 of the 6 guns, towards the perceived Zulu army. Up in the hills, above the camp, the Zulu scouts, concealed in the long grass, watched the column go. It had been the Zulu intention not to attack that day, but the white tents on the plain below, resembling a great herd of white cattle, seemed to be theirs for the taking. The first indication that it was not well came early in the day. By 8 o'clock, Lieutenant Colonel Pullane, the officer left in command of the camp, sent an alarming message to Lord Chelmsford, now 10 miles away to the east, which read,
Report just come in that the Zulus are advancing in force from the left front of the camp.
The general read the note and replied,
There's nothing to be done on that.
and thus the fate of the camp was sealed. But there was even greater cause for alarm. Earlier still, a cavalry vedette 6 miles from the camp was all but surrounded by thousands of warriors who continued advancing towards Isandlwana. At about 10 o'clock, Lieutenant Chard of the Royal Engineers recorded that
An NCO of the 24th lent me a field glass, which was a very good one, and I could see the enemy moving on the distant hills, and apparently in great force. Large numbers of them moving to my left until the hill of Isandlwana hid them from my view.
Alarmed at the sight, Chard mounted his horse and hurried back to his post at Rorke's Drift, where, later in the day, he would achieve lasting fame and the Victoria Cross. On his way, he met Colonel Anthony Durnford with a Natal native horse, and on hearing Chard's news, Durnford hurried on to his Isandlwana camp. Also in camp, Lieutenant Charles Pope of the 24th Regiment hurriedly scribbled in his diary,
3 columns of Zulus and mounted men on hill to the east. 7,000 more to the northeast.
It was the last entry that Pope would ever make. Chelmsford's standing orders were that all camps should be entrenched, but this order had not been complied with during the previous 2 days, and now there was neither the time nor the manpower. Further orders were to the effect that in the event of a possible attack, all tents should be struck, in other words, dropped to the ground by pulling out the center pole in order to obtain a clear field of fire and to deny an enemy concealment. At about 10:30 a.m., Durnford and his reinforcements arrived, which included 250 men of the Natal native horse. Very different to, and not to be confused with, the Natal native contingent. Every man rode his own horse, carried a breech-loading carbine and a quiver of throwing spears. A Royal Artillery rocket battery, escorted by a number of Natal native contingent, completed his column. Durnford had vague orders from Chelmsford to reinforce the camp. Durnford had already seen Zulus on the heights, but showing no concern, dismounted his men and conferred with Colonel Pullane over a hasty breakfast. The exact content of their discussion eludes historians to this day, providing a cornerstone for the shifting of blame, which would be quick in following the disaster. Durnford, senior in service to Pullane, could in fact have taken command, but he had not been ordered to do so, and, like so many others that day, apparently saw no danger to the camp, despite the report that thousands of warriors were swarming in the hills. Durnford, it seems, acting on no stronger intelligence than that provided by vague reports and his own intuition, decided that the Zulus were about to attack Lord Chelmsford, wherever he might be out in the hills 12 miles away. And Durnford therefore decided it was incumbent upon him to attack the Zulus. Thereupon he dispatched 100 mounted men under the command of Shepston and Raw to the Nuwe heights, and 50 more back down the road to escort his wagons. Then Durnford, with the remaining 100 mounted men, set off at a spanking pace across the plain past Conical Hill with the intention of attacking the Zulus wherever he could find them. The rocket battery and the Natal native contingent on foot, left to follow, now trailing far behind, were at the mercy of the advancing Zulu army. Meanwhile, Colonel Pullane, believing there was no immediate peril to the camp, nevertheless deployed his troops. 2 companies of the 24th, under Lieutenants Mostyn and Cavey, were sent off to the heights to support the 2 troops of Natal native horse. The rest of the Imperial infantry were illogically scattered in skirmishing order far out from the camp and their ammunition supply, in a dogleg facing the Nuwe heights and the eastern plain, so far out that, as can be seen from this reconstruction picture, they were scarcely visible, with 2 Royal Artillery guns somewhere near the center. But it was not a solid line of redcoats, shoulder to shoulder and 2 deep, as this contemporary picture would lead us to believe, but a meager line with men strung out in little groups, yards apart. Lieutenant Curling, the only officer to survive from the firing line, later wrote that the companies of infantry were in fact at half strength. If this were true, where the other halves might have been employed from the camp remains a mystery. The camp was later described as defenseless as an English village, with the air of a racecourse on a public holiday. And all seemed completely unaware that the Zulu movements they had been witnessing all morning was the deployment of 23,000 warriors, now poised along the Nuwe ridge with their commander, 60-year-old Jingwayoka Mahole, surveying the scene below. The Zulu army was now ready to move in the formation of a buffalo head, with the horns thrown out on either flank to completely encircle the camp. On their spur above the camp, amongst the rocks and aloes where many cartridge cases have been found in recent years, Mostyn and Cavey's companies of the 24th Regiment opened fire on thousands of Zulus as they poured past 800 yards away, to disappear beyond a ridge. What they had witnessed was the right horn of the Zulu army taking up position. So it was that the tide of Zulu warriors swept down onto the plain, the left and right horns racing towards the camp. The rocket battery, isolated and defenseless, was the first to be overrun. Next, Durnford encountered the leading ranks of the Zulu left horn, sweeping down onto the plain. But with a cool head and admirable discipline, kept their advance at bay as he and the Natal native horse fought a slow, running battle. At the same time, the men that Durnford had dispatched to the plateau were also amongst the first to encounter the oncoming tide. Lieutenant Raw, commanding one of the troops, and who would be one of the few survivors, later reported,
"We left the camp proceeding over the hills, the enemy in small groups retiring before us for some time, drawing us on. When they turned and fell upon us, the whole army showing itself from behind a hill in front, where they had evidently been waiting."
Raw and his men also fell back towards the camp, and as they went, joined forces with Mostyn and Cave's companies of the 24th, and on reaching the camp, they halted for a while, the onrush of the Zulu. Down in the camp, Colonel Pullane, now beyond all doubt that the Zulu army had found him rather than Chelmsford finding it, still inexplicably neither ordered the tents to be struck nor the firing line drawn in. But the infantry, who were about to face the whole of the Zulu center, remained confident, full of cheer, and at 800 yards, opened fire on the tide of jogging warriors. But as the warriors came, they frequently entered undulating terrain and disappeared from sight. The recently installed memorial to the Royal Artillery dead marks the spot where the two guns stood that day. Yet, as can be seen, the oncoming Zulus would have advanced into the shelter of a vast depression, or, as it is termed, dead ground, and would only have been vulnerable for the last 150 yards, which would have taken the athletic warriors less than 35 seconds to cross. The extent of the dead ground is revealed by this present-day picture of the camp. From the position of the guns marked A, all of the huts marked B, numbering over 100, are not visible, and thus the dead ground hid and protected the attacking warriors. Yet the thin line of redcoats brought the Zulu regiments of the Umbonambi and the Ingobamakhosi and the Umqicho to bay, the warriors seeking shelter among the grass and rocks. The great commanders of the Zulu army watched from the Inyoni Ridge, amongst them several of the king's royal brothers, Prince Ndabugo of the Umbonambi regiment, his half-brother, Prince Shingana, Prince Dabula Manzi of the Utulwana regiment, a well-known trader with the white settlers of Natal, Zipepu, hereditary chief of the Mandlagazi, who would shortly be wounded in the battle. All were there. And at the same time as the ammunition dwindled to a few rounds apiece, an elderly Zulu Induna named Mkhosana Kamvundlana, a chief of the Biela, inspired his warriors to make another charge, shouting, "Haidina lapaya, ningabalegi, mklavana wapulumlilo kashongonjalo." Your king sent you here to kill red soldiers, not to hide in the grass. Out on the plain, Colonel Durnford's column clashed with the advancing left horn of the Zulu army. However, he made a fighting retreat, taking shelter in a deep donga where he and his Edendale and Hlubi troops of native horse held the enemy at bay until, out of ammunition, they fled towards the camp. A Zulu warrior of the Umqicho regiment would later recall,
"We were now falling very fast. The enemy had just put their horses in a donga, and we were firing away at us on the foot. We shouted, 'Husutu!' and made for the donga, driving them out towards the tents."
Mr. Chelmsford Ntanzi, yes, Chelmsford is his given name, who plows his land not 50 yards from the donga, testifies to the many empty cartridge cases that once littered the area.
Izinjomane zika-1040 zazimkhona khona lapha zidubula zibhekisa lena ebuthweni bengobamakhosi amazulu eza laphana ekhankasile laphana. Yonke leya ndawo lena uphondo lwesinxele lwehlisa njalo-ke lwehla lapha. Luhamba njalo luyafika khona lena. AmaZulu ayigcwele yonke lapha leya ndawo lezansi kwentaba lapha umathutshane laphana.
Meanwhile, the retreating infantry, to their disbelief and horror, found the camp was swarming with Zulus, their assegais already red with blood. The right horn of the Zulu army had entered the camp unopposed around the rear of Isandlwana Hill. Away in the direction taken by Chelmsford that morning, Commandant Hamilton Brown, who had been returning to camp with a battalion of Natal native contingent, had been all but surrounded by the left horn, but had been disdainfully left alone as the warriors pressed onto the camp for richer pickings. So he took up a defensive position on an isolated ridge 3.5 miles from the camp, where, through his field glasses, he witnessed all of the horror of the ensuing battle. From the first moment, Brown had sent gallopers off with the fearful news to find Lord Chelmsford, but his lordship was not to be found. He was meandering in the valleys and hills to the east with his staff and a small escort, still wondering what had become of the Zulu army. Over the next few hours, Brown sent 3 more messages, each being treated with disdain and disbelief. One staff officer, Major Gossett, exclaiming,
What bosh!
But there was no possibility of misconstruing Brown's last frantic plea, which read,
For God's sake, come back! The camp is surrounded and must be taken!
And more sinister yet, the whole of Zululand turned dark as the sun was near eclipsed. In the camp itself, the redcoats and the scattering of colonials, outnumbered 30-1, either fought to the death or fought to escape. Sergeant Major Nyanda of the Natal Native Horse recalled that
The Zulus then closed with us. The cannon was firing, but that did not hit anyone. We were then chased into a camp and saw many soldiers and horsemen, all mixed together, being as a guide, and anyone who could save himself tried to do so.
And Jingwayo, the Zulu commander, at his battle position on the Nyoni Ridge, watched the horns of his army close. A Zulu warrior later recalled how he had killed a soldier.
As he raised his right arm that held a revolver and was about to fire, I stabbed him in the armpit. I pushed in my spear. I did not hear him cry out. I pushed it until he died.
Lieutenant Curling of the Royal Artillery, in the firing line with the guns, escaped and later wrote,
The Zulus advanced steadily in the face of the infantry and our guns. When we got the order to retire, we limbered up at once, but were hardly in time, as the Zulus were on us at once, stabbing men as they ran. Finally, the guns got stuck and could go no further. In a moment, the Zulus closed in, and the drivers were pulled off their horses and killed.
Another warrior recalled,
The whole place was twisting mass of soldiers and Zulus fighting. The Ngoba Makosi, the Umbonambi were all killing. I carried no gun, only 2 throwing spears and assegai. There was a white man. He was holding onto an assegai held by a friend of mine, so I stabbed him in the back.
Colonel Durnford and his Natal Native Horse had fought their way back into the camp, where Durnford rallied colonial soldiers of the Carbineers and mounted police. For without a horse, there was no escape. Sergeant Major Molife, Durnford's devoted NCO, tried desperately to persuade his chief to mount and flee, but Durnford was determined to stay and die. His last stand was to be described in glowing Victorian prose.
there came a restless, surging wave of encircling warriors who, though constantly smitten by a leadened hail, broke through to sweep on again with renewed force. Durnford, who, having slowly fallen back before the ever-increasing flow, now determined to die. Recognizing his commanding courage, around him gathered some 20 similar spirits who, nobly disdaining death, resolved to cover the retreat of the guns or die with them.
Captain Younghusband and his company, more or less intact, fought their way to the shoulder of Isandlwana, and there, with all ammunition gone, there came a cry.
Fix bayonets and die like British soldiers do.
And die they did.
There were no Geneva Conventions at Isandlwana. The best the soldiers could expect was a brutal death, followed by ritual mutilation, for it was part of Zulu belief that the spirit of an enemy must be set free through disembowelment. With the horns of the Zulu army all but closed, the road back to Rorke's Drift and Natal was cut. But yet there remained a small gap through which those who still survived began to pour. It was a route that forever after would be known as the Fugitives' Trail, a place where graves abound, occasionally revealing to this day the gruesome remains of men who died there over 120 years ago. The trail led to the Buffalo River, 6 miles away, but over a terrain of rocks, dongas, swamp, and riverbeds. A nightmare of broken ground where the fleet-footed warriors could run faster than a horse. Paul Brickhill, a bespectacled civilian with the column, employed as an interpreter, described the race for life.
Our flight I shall never forget. No path, no track, boulders everywhere. Our way was already strewn with abandoned shields, hats, clothing, bandoliers and saddles. Our stampede was composed of mules, oxen, horses and flying men, all strangely intermingled. Man and beast all infested with the danger which surrounded us.
Lieutenant Horace Smith-Dorian, who until a few moments earlier had been frantically trying to open ammunition boxes, later recalled,
Everybody who had a horse turned to fly. The ground down there to the river was so broken that the Zulus went as fast as the horses and kept killing all the way.
Brickhill was an honest man and brave enough to admit to his own cowardice when he came upon a friend in need.
How one's bosom steels itself to pity at such a time. I came up with poor Band Sergeant Gamble, tottering and tumbling about amongst the stones. He said, "For God's sake, give me a lift." I said, "My dear fellow, it's a case of life and death with me." Closing my eyes, I put spur to my horse and bounded ahead. That was the last I saw of him.
But the British flight was not all panic and despair. Captain Edgar Anstey had kept his company together, retreating in a semblance of good order, 60 or 70 toughs of the 24th together. At first, there were easier pickings for the Zulus. But at last, weary, wounded, and surrounded, Anstey probably shouted,
"Sergeant, order form square!"
And in that time-honored formation of the British Army on the banks of the Manzinyama stream, they fought and died together. A tributary of the Manzinyama stream was a natural barrier, an obstacle of a nightmare steeplechase. Yet to live, it must be crossed. One impatient rider on a fine grey horse with leg and spur put his mount at the moat, but man and horse fell far short, and both were crushed 12 feet below. By now, most of those unmounted had been overtaken and put to death, whilst the surviving horsemen faced a steep, rock-strewn hill, and higher up, a meadowland. Alas, a ghastly trap of nature. The meadow was a swamp. Brickhill's horse sunk in it up to its hocks, and on spurring his mount, the animal reared so violently that Brickhill lost his spectacles. It was so serious a loss that for moments he peered into the green bog in the hope of seeing the reflection of his glasses. But a volley of Zulu bullets sped him on his way. Even nature seemed to have closed ranks against the fugitives. Those lucky enough to have reached the banks of the Buffalo River, and this contemporary picture shows the distance and direction of their flight, found the river in full spate, running like a mill race at 7 knots, and along its banks, those of the Natal native contingent that had got that far were being slain rather than face the river. Private Sam Wassell of the 80th Regiment was about to ride in when he saw his friend Private Westwood up to his armpits and being harassed by Zulus. Wassell rode to the rescue and was awarded the Victoria Cross for his bravery. Smith Dorrien also reached the river, but at a spot so steep that he dismounted. Hard on his heels, Major Stuart Smith of the Royal Artillery shouted,
For God's sake, get on, man! The Zulus are on top of us!
And at that moment, Smith Dorrien's horse was assegaied. It plunged, falling into the river, whilst Major Smith was likewise speared to death. Smith Dorrien remembered,
I gave up all hope, as the Zulus were all around me, finishing off the wounded. However, with the strong hope that everybody clings to that an accident would turn up, I rushed off on foot and plunged into the river.
Yet it is doubtful if anyone would have survived had it not been for Sergeant Major Simeon Kambule and the Edendale troop of the Natal Native Horse, the only unit to reach the drift still in fighting formation. Kambule drove the pursuing Zulus from the riverbank, then, having crossed the river, dismounted his men and covered the retreat of the fugitives that followed, giving them a moment of safety before attempting to cross the swirling waters. Trooper Barker of the Natal Carbineers, who survived the battle, later recalled, had it not been for the Natal Native Horse, who were already on the Natal bank, I doubt if a single white man would have escaped by fugitives' drift. Of the 900 white men left in camp, fewer than 60 survived the battle and subsequent flight. The number of black soldiers who survived will never be known. The fugitives' trail and drift will always be synonymous with the saving of the Queen's colour, the joint efforts of Lieutenants Melville and Coghill of the 24th. Separated at the river, Coghill, who had already safely crossed, glanced back and saw his friend in great distress. At once, Coghill plunged back, but his horse was shot dead in mid-stride, and within moments, both Melville and Coghill were stranded against a large black boulder, still known to this day as Coffin Rock. Here, Melville lost his grip upon the colour, which was swept away into a whirlpool. Unburdened, they pushed off from Coffin Rock and managed to swim the river. Though the colour was later recovered, they, utterly exhausted, were overtaken on the Natal bank and put to death. Their lonely graves, facing back towards Isandlwana and overlooking Fugitives' Drift, keep vigil to this day. Years later, both would receive the posthumous award of the Victoria Cross. Whilst the battle raged, and after the survivors had fled towards the river, Hamilton Brown's messengers still vainly strove to bring Chelmsford and his column to the rescue. Finally, about mid-afternoon, Chelmsford, wishing reassurance, arrived with an escort to survey the camp, which, through his field glasses, could be plainly seen to be in tatters, with the rampaging warriors still active amongst the tents and burning wagons. Chelmsford, striving to repulse the cold hand of apprehension, exclaimed,
But I left over 1,000 men to guard the camp.
Even at that moment, a few soldiers still survived in the devastation of one redcoat of the 24th, found refuge in this cave, where he kept the enemy at bay for 4 hours until the Zulus finally killed him. 9 months later, his skeleton, with a rope around his neck, was found 10 yards from the entrance. As dusk began to fall, Chelmsford, having at last summoned the rest of the column to join him, advanced in fighting formation towards the camp, where little remained except chaos, destruction, and death. And there, throughout the dark night, surrounded by the Zulu campfires, in apprehension, they waited for the dawn. The Zulu warriors had fought savagely and bravely, but also suffered heavy casualties. So many, in fact, that King Cetshwayo lamented that it was as though an assegai had been thrust into the belly of the Zulu nation. But they had beaten the Red Soldiers of Queen Victoria, inflicting one of the worst defeats ever to befall British arms. What could account for such a massive disaster? 7 months later, the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army wrote,
"The primary cause of the misfortune, and which led to all the others, was the underestimate formed of the fighting power of the Zulu army."
However, Chelmsford and his column, due to the magnificent victory of a company of the 24th Regiment left behind at Rorke's Drift, survived. But the unjust war continued for almost half a year. Yet strange, and almost unaccountably, good has come out of evil. Despite the bloody battles and encounters of the Anglo-Zulu War, there was always respect, one side for the other, especially for the bravery of both. And Induna was to exclaim in honor of the British,
"Basizwa njengamadwala, onke amadoda abuyele endaweni zabo, kuhle kwamabhubesi kade elwa."
and a British general was to write,
"Nowhere within southern or central Africa did such a well-disciplined force of courageous men exist as lay at the command of the Zulu king."
From this, a mutual admiration grew until almost 120 years later, with the approval of the British and South African governments and the sanction of Queen Elizabeth and King Goodwill Zwelithini, the Royal Regiment of Wales, the descendant regiment of the old 24th, and 121 Zulu Battalion, South African Defence Force, jointly affiliated. The first time in the history of the British Army that a British regiment has affiliated with a former foe. Thus, they have done honor to one another. And today, the local community, many with ancestors who fought at Isandlwana, enjoy the songs of courtship rather than the songs of war. And on the former battlefield, in the shadow of Isandlwana Hill,
Ethunda nyekeza mntakamangondwana.